Hello again, everybody. It's Laurie White, President of the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to episode number 106 of Chamber TV. And today, a very timely topic, and we have with us one of the foremost experts in political commentary anywhere in this country, Dr. Wendy Schiller. And Wendy is the chair of the Political Science Department at Brown University and also the Royce Family Professor of Teaching Excellence in Political Science at Brown and a longtime member of the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce and a frequent contributor to our dialogue here on Chamber TV. Wendy, how are you today?
I'm good, Laurie. Good to be here.
Great. Thanks for taking the time. So, let's just begin by asking how are you and how are your students doing and how's the semester going for you?
Well, Brown just started virtually, in our quiet period, and I'm working still as the chair of the Political Science Department, and I'm excited that I'm actually teaching in summer session this year. So I taught last semester, and I'm not teaching this semester, and then I'm teaching in summer session, which we haven't had before, a full summer semester. So I'm excited to teach mostly freshmen and sophomores, and that'll be Intro to American Politics. So that'll be a good time of year to start, about May, and things that ought to be a little more settled with the president's cabinet and other things in Washington, as well as Rhode Island politics. So it should be a lot of fun.
Well, that's a perfect segue into our first topic, and that is Governor Gina Raimondo potentially heading to Washington to be Secretary of Commerce in the Biden administration. So it's understood that confirmation hearings will likely start this week. We are recording this episode on Monday, January 25th. So the question is, Wendy, how do you view this development for Rhode Island?
Well, I think it's going to be a lot of change to get used to. We've had Governor Raimondo in office, and should she be confirmed by the Senate, and it looks like the Senate Republicans are not objecting strenuously to President Biden's cabinet nominations thus far. We know the governor has her hearings this week in the Senate Commerce Committee. Now, the hearings are technically still run by the Republicans, because there hasn't been a power sharing agreement reached by the Democrats and Republicans. So it's confusing for most people. Do the Democrats control the Senate or don't they? And at the moment, in the organization of the Senate, the Republicans are still chairing these committees, although they are, as we saw with the defense nominee and our own Senator Jack Reed in Armed Services last week, being very deferential to the ranking member, the Democrat, who will become the chair once they reach a power sharing agreement. So we don't know quite who will chair this hearing for Governor Raimondo, but should she do well in the hearing and there be no objections, that nomination should get reported out of the committee by the end of the week and possibly even to the Senate floor. It's possible that she could be confirmed when she gives her last State of the Union address in Rhode Island. So we're waiting to see what the timing is like, but that will be an interesting circumstance.
Now, you said State of the Union. I think you mean State of the State.
That's right. That's right.
Are you getting ahead of yourself, Wendy?
No, it's funny. I slipped because normally we have the president giving the State of the Union at this time of the year. But of course, we have a new president, so there's no State of the Union this year. So good catch, Laurie.
Yes. So in terms of the imprint that she will make on commerce as Commerce Secretary, presuming, of course, that she wins Senate confirmation. What do you think this means for Rhode Island from a business perspective?
It's an interesting thing. When you pick a cabinet nominee from a state, which, everyone's from a state, but who's had an elected position in the state, like governor, there's two things that can happen. The governor can certainly take the lessons of Rhode Island and say, look, what states are like Rhode Island? Where are their economies shifting from manufacturing to service to technology? I have experience with that, so I can help across the country. Does that shift anything specific to Rhode Island? Probably not, because she'll probably go out of her way not to help Rhode Island particularly, but she will tout the good things about Rhode Island and certainly point to a labor force that was, as I said, used to manufacturing, had to shift to service and also to technology, also in the pandemic being hit in terms of tourism, entertainment, and of course, dining, right? We've had our restaurant industry and our tourist industry, and some parts of the state have done okay and haven't been as damaged. We know Newport, for example, as we might have feared, but certainly Providence for tourism and for restaurants and dining has really been very badly hit. So when you think about that, other states have similar circumstances. So I think she can take her experience from Rhode Island and whatever they come up with to help the country based on modeling it on those kinds of needs should help Rhode Island.
So that's interesting that you don't necessarily believe that she will put Rhode Island at the forefront of her work or may studiously avoid being perceived as that. We did have an opportunity to talk to her a couple of weeks ago, and her point of view at the time was that delivering this role for Rhode Islanders as Secretary of Commerce would, in fact, she would continue to keep Rhode Island at the very forefront of the things that she cares about in life.
Well, I mean, just being from Rhode Island, right? I mean, every time you announce, Gina Raimondo, Commerce Secretary, former governor and treasurer of Rhode Island, brings Rhode Island into the national conversation. So, of course, that's going to happen. But, cabinet secretaries are accountable to the Congress, they're accountable to the Senate, they're accountable to the president, and that's a national job. So I do think, to me, the combination of having Gina Raimondo of Rhode Island potentially be Commerce Secretary, Jack Reed, chair of the Armed Services Committee, which is a very powerful position, Jim Langevin on the House Armed Services Committee, and having Sheldon Whitehouse rising the ranks, by the way, on the Environment and Public Works Committee and on Judiciary in the Senate, and David Cicilline also on the Judiciary Committee in the House. You've got a very powerful contingent of influential Rhode Islanders who are getting national attention, not only in the government structure, but also from the national media. And that puts Rhode Island in the conversation where people think, okay, what's special about Rhode Island? They seem to produce, a disproportionate amount of national leadership. And that's a good thing. That's an asset for Rhode Island. So it should help, I think. And it should also help in another way, which is that when Rhode Island is really at the forefront of innovation, when we're trying new things, for example, we were ahead of the game on testing from the beginning. We're still really good on testing. It's one of the reasons we have a lot of positive cases, but we have a lot of testing, and the governor worked hard to make that testing relatively accessible. Thinking about having hybrid education, remote education, in person for kids, for teachers, how to work that out. We see other states struggling mightily with that. We're still struggling, but I think they're working better together than a lot of places. There are things Rhode Island has done that I think the governor can talk about as Commerce Secretary. And I think that that is going to be important for bringing maybe private foundation support for some of these programs and thinking about businesses. Maybe we want to relocate and come to Rhode Island. So I think there's a lot of potential here. It's unclear how it will all play out, but I think Rhode Island itself has set itself up as an example of producing the best the country can offer in leadership. And in a lot of policy issues, the best we can offer in dealing with the pandemic.
Those are very interesting observations, Wendy, and I agree wholeheartedly with that. So let's paint a picture, if you will, of what's going to happen during her hearing. So tell us, based on your deep level of experience in witnessing confirmation hearings and then the vote by the Senate, what should we be watching for?
Well, I think that a typical cabinet hearing in the Senate committee is that the staff members of the senators who are on the committee will prepare questions and a briefing book. You'll see all the senators frequently either have a formal paper briefing book or now sometimes a tablet where they have all the documentation on a computer in front of them, depending on how savvy they are. And they'll go to prepared questions. And frequently for commerce, the senators will ask Governor Raimondo about policies the Commerce Department would have that affect the most important economic industries in their states. So if they're a farm state, if they're an exporting state, if they're a state that relies heavily on guesswork or agriculture, like Arizona, let's say California, if they're a state that deals heavily in tourism affected by the pandemic, that is something that the governor can talk about. because it's a big part of our economy. So if you're Florida and you're hurting on that front, or your other states, like even Philadelphia, our sort of home of independence, in Pennsylvania. So depending on who sits on the committee, you'll have those questions geared towards her that really affect business development and economic development. She has a background in that. So she has not only ideas about what Rhode Island has done, but certainly what can be done in other states. Now, there could be some bumps in the road. Republicans could ask her about the pension system. That is generally touted to be a success, having cut the COLA, but of course it was met with significant resistance, obviously to the retirees that lost that COLA. So there may be states, Republicans that ask about it in a favorable way, but it may be Democrats ask about it in a critical way. She'll have to defend that. And of course, UHIP, in terms of technology, the Obama administration had a terrible rollout initially with Obamacare from the computer system itself. The Commerce Department doesn't necessarily run all those same social welfare programs, but certainly the advent of technology, how do you protect the technology from cyber attack, but how do you update Commerce Department systems? So I assume the governor's being briefed on how the Commerce Department runs in terms of its computer infrastructure and its software systems, what deals it makes with different providers. And I think she might get asked about that because that was, as you know, a somewhat expensive proposition for the state. It's possible 38 Studios comes up, although that's not generally associated with Governor Raimondo, and she doesn't necessarily take any blame for that. But I think those are all things that will come up possibly. I think the Democrats may raise the pension issue and protecting workers, and the Republicans will probably point to small businesses in Rhode Island and say, what have you done for them? So I don't think it'll be too rocky for the governor, but of course there's always a couple of questions that are less pleasant than all the rest of the questions.
Well, as of this moment, it appears that Senator Wicker will be leading the committee charge with Senator Maria Cantwell as the ranking member. What do we know about their profiles and their priorities?
Well, it's interesting. Senator Roger Wicker, I believe he's a Republican from Mississippi, and he's an interesting person. He just was presiding over the confirmation hearing of Pete Buttigieg for Secretary of Transportation. And they grilled Buttigieg, who's a mayor, but as mayor of South Bend, Indiana, was very interested in public transportation and infrastructure. So they had apparently a very good hearing, and he was praised, Buttigieg, for his testimony and his performance in the hearing by Roger Wicker. So it doesn't look like Wicker's out to get anybody here. What's interesting is Maria Cantwell comes from Washington State. And what's interesting about Maria Cantwell, she comes from a business background and somewhat technologically related. So I think in that way, there might be a lot of bonding or synergy between Governor Raimondo and Maria Cantwell in terms of maybe their mutual love of data. Governor Raimondo frequently refers to herself as a data nerd, and Maria Cantwell comes from a business background, a woman who made it in business, and comes from a sector of the economy that the governor has been trying to promote in Rhode Island. So that'll be an interesting conversation. That's where I see Maria Cantwell's questions coming from. And Maria Cantwell also is part of an all-female delegation from Washington State and has been part of that delegation since the mid-90s. So she's been around in the Senate a long time and been part of female leadership in Washington State for a long time. So I expect that to be not necessarily a love fest, but I expect that to be a very dynamic interaction between the two of them. And I don't think there's anything that Senator Wicker has in store to sort of, gotcha questions for Governor Raimondo. But that'll be an interesting thing. And as a woman watching politics, this probably would not have happened 20 years ago. You wouldn't have had a ranking member, Maria Cantwell, in position to be chair of the Commerce Committee from a tech background, asking a two-time governor of Rhode Island who started her own venture capital firm these questions. So when you think about the state of the country, you think about women, you think about women in the economy, and you think about women in politics. Every time you see this, I sort of like to stop and pause and say, let's not take it for granted, because it probably wasn't something we would have seen 2 decades ago.
So let's think a little bit about the dynamics and the persona and the communications techniques that are no doubt will be very much spotlighted during the course of this hearing. So do you expect that we will see a different persona from what we are familiar with here in Rhode Island from Governor Gina Raimondo, given that she is now talking to a different audience?
Lori, that's a great question. So in a Senate cabinet hearing or any kind of congressional testimony, just like a regular courtroom, the idea is do no harm, taking from the medical profession. Don't say more than you need to when you're answering a question. So I expect the governor to be very herself. I think her style, the way she speaks, the words she uses, I think that will all be the same as what we're used to. But she tends to go a little further in her press conferences and not ad lib, but she'll talk to us as if she's part of our family in Rhode Island. That's the way she's communicated throughout the entire pandemic. That's not the way she's likely to talk to the Senate. I think that she'll be, like I said, as natural and candid as possible, but probably will have been told by her team, which is Biden team, prepping her. Not that she needs a lot of prep, but prepping her for this experience, not to go too far beyond the answer to the question.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So do you think the vote, in fact, will occur simultaneous to her State of the State address to Rhode Islanders, or do you perceive that it will happen sooner, as an example?
Well, this is this is an interesting thing, and it's sort of beyond everybody's control in some ways. President Biden, really wants his cabinet, as many cabinet members in place before the impeachment trial starts of former President Donald Trump. And my understanding is that will start the week of February 8th. He really wants his cabinet done. I'm not privy to the inside details, but I expect part of the deal that extended the time for the former president to prepare for his trial. He was indicted on inciting insurrection, and he'll be tried on that charge of inciting insurrection stemming from the events of January 6th. Now, they can't add any charges to it at the moment. It's like an indictment. It's all set. But other things may come up about Donald Trump, his phone call to the Secretary of State in Georgia, for example, this new revelation that he had an idea of possibly firing the Attorney General and asking the new Attorney General to stop the Georgia results. Since he didn't do that, it's not really something they can consider in the trial. But you can understand where this could snowball. You can understand where this may, in some of the speeches by senators, they don't give a lot of speeches, but in their questions, this could snowball out of control. So the Democrats and Senator Biden and President Biden want to make sure as many cabinet members are installed and sworn in as possible before that starts. So if it's not right before her State of the State, it should be pretty much the day after or the day after that. I don't see any reason why the Commerce Committee can't have this hearing and then vote out the nomination from committee by the end of the week. The Senate could take it up as soon as Thursday or Friday, depending on how quickly these things go. But, these are the kinds of things that are part of the package between the Republicans and the Democrats jockeying for how they lay out how the Senate will run as a 50-50 institution.
Mm-hmm. So that creates a bit of a lag, though. The timing doesn't quite square.
Right. The timing doesn't quite work unless there's some significant pressure to get this done. And certainly, if you want an economic recovery and you're the Republicans, one of the most important cabinet secretaries to you is the Commerce Secretary. So you want, labor, you want commerce, and the labor nomination goes to a different committee in the Senate, Marty Walsh, the mayor of Boston. So, you may say defense, and of course, Janet Yellen will most likely be sworn in. Well, I'm sorry, most likely be voted up by the Senate today or tomorrow at the latest as Secretary of the Treasury. So then you'll get Secretary of State, and that has to get through. So Biden really wants defense, Homeland Security, State, and Treasury all in this week. Those are sort of the big four. The original in our country's founding was, of course, Treasury, State, and War. That was the name for it rather than defense. So he wants those powerhouse cabinet things done now. But I don't think he wants to have any of them out there lingering before the trial starts. And I think that's going to be an interesting negotiating situation for the Republicans and the Democrats for the next 2 weeks.
Well, of course, we know that Governor Raimondo has a very close relationship with Treasury Secretary designee Janet Yellen. Janet Yellen came to Rhode Island and spoke at the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce annual Economic Outlook luncheon a couple of years ago, and the two very famously, approached Chair Yellen's speech from a unified perspective, if you will, in terms of what's ailing this nation's economy. So we expect that the fact that they have a pre-existing rapport will, of course, accelerate the kind of work that we can expect on a national level for the economic recovery.
I think that's a good way of looking at it. I think the big question for everybody in the country is, how do we get what we need to get done and not raise taxes? And I think this is the big potential split in the Democratic Party. You know, the Republican Party will be dominated by Trump for quite some time, maybe 6 months, maybe 9 months, maybe longer. But it will be dominated by people who want to carry on President Trump's ideology. But most importantly, the Republicans will want to preserve every aspect of President Trump's tax cut bill from 2017. And every single aspect. They're going into 2022 Senate races. There's 21 Republican seats to defend. There are fewer Democratic seats to defend. So the Senate will be up for grabs in 2022. Americans don't like the idea of raising taxes. So where you go in terms of how do you preserve small businesses exemptions? How do you make sure that if we go to a $15 minimum wage, which Rhode Island hasn't done yet, if that is something that actually takes off and the federal government raises its minimum wage, it won't raise it, I don't think, to $15. But certainly if it raises considerably, that puts pressure on all the other states. Then you have additional labor costs. Then you have lots of things small business worries about. That's a big, big deal to Rhode Island. But it's a big deal to voters everywhere. And so this is, how do you negotiate that? So that's where the Yellen-Raimondo relationship will come in to be very important. Because if Yellen, and the president are leaning towards raising taxes that'll hurt small businesses in a cabinet meeting, Governor Raimondo will speak up and say, listen, I come from a place where people own small businesses. You have to keep this in mind. You can't just load up extra costs on small businesses and still expect them to hire people. So I think that will be Governor Raimondo's role, is how do you figure out how to manage the larger Democratic progressive movement towards higher taxes and make sure that the engine of the economy, at least in Rhode Island, which is small businesses, can stay vibrant. And that's where I see Raimondo's voice in that cabinet meeting as important. And, we'll see where everything lies. I just don't see large tax hikes getting through the United States Senate right now. I don't think they even get through the House. The House, Democrats only have a 5-seat majority. So this is going to be an issue that comes up. The President Biden, wants to raise the highest level of income tax rates from 37.5%, I think, to 39%. So, that's on the highest earners. And I think there are some things that basically in people making over $400,000 or $450,000 have not had to pay more taxes. The Medicare tax from Obamacare is still intact, but so the question is, do you start going after that group? And then again, if those are small business owners, if some of their wealth comes from, or their income comes from small businesses and they employ people, and you start taxing them higher, that runs into problems. So I see Raimondo's role as sort of trying to bring to that Washington room, that Washington perspective, a small state governing perspective that says, listen, these are real people with real businesses. And if you want to raise money and you need tax revenue, let's figure out a way to do it that has the least negative impact on small businesses. And fortunately, Senator Biden comes from a small state too, although Delaware is kind of an interesting state. They had a lot of banking and a lot of corporations that move there for tax purposes. And they have a lot of agriculture actually in Delaware. So it's an interesting state. It's not quite like Rhode Island. But I think that Biden will be somewhat sympathetic to that. But that will be Raimondo's voice in that cabinet room. When you think about the rest of the cabinet, that's where she's going to come in. So I see that as something that small business owners and business owners in general in Rhode Island should continue to communicate to Governor Raimondo how important a well-targeted tax structure is to economic well-being.
You raise an interesting point there, Wendy, and you are an expert on political communication, political prose, if you will. Why is this message so elusive? Why is it so difficult to convey? And why does the progressive message sound so much more palatable?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, when you think about the minimum wage and you think about the strain on government revenue in terms of supplementary social welfare programs like food stamps, for example, or Medicaid, for example, or Obama exchanges, which are financed differently, but the Medicaid expansion under Obama. When you think about those sorts of even Section 8 or housing vouchers or assistance there, you think about all the money that is spent by the government to help people who work for a living, but who do not make enough money to survive, to pay rent, to feed their families, to live in a safe, clean environment. You think about that, and we don't see that money. We just, the average taxpayer who doesn't receive those benefits doesn't see that money. But that's money going out the door. That is money, and that is tax dollars going out the door. Now, it's a combination of state and mostly federal tax dollars, but it's still money going out the door. If you could convey the argument and sensibly say, if we pay people more money per hour, we can reduce some of these other costs. Now, that would take a restructuring of federal aid, as we know, and certainly if you could reduce healthcare costs. If you could have, not Medicare for all necessarily, I'm not necessarily advocating or recommending that as a policy that the Democrats put forth, but something where you had some of the insurance costs for businesses reduced so that they could, in fact, offer their employees more hours without having to offer very expensive health insurance. Some way of integrating private and public responsibility for healthcare that is better managed and less expensive, then the inclination would be, okay, I can give these workers more hours, and maybe I can go up in my hourly wage because my other taxes aren't going to rental subsidy and to healthcare subsidy and to food subsidy. So this is where it's a complicated story, but it's one that you could try to start explaining to the average taxpayer that isn't the recipient of these benefits. That if we were to go higher, and in fact give small businesses a tax credit, if I'm going to have to incur extra costs for minimum wage and for healthcare benefits, then I get additional tax credits off that, or something like that. I think you could bring together these two big constituencies in the Democratic Party. But without that explanation, it's very hard to do. This sort of myth, and it's a myth, this myth, I work for a living, I work hard, I don't want to give my money to those people, whoever those people are. Those people are working hard too. They're working, they just don't make enough money to survive. But that shouldn't be on the backs of small businesses alone. So that's the problem. And I think that's the first myth-busting responsibility I think Gina Raimondo will have as Commerce Secretary. But the Democrats more generally have to start saying, listen, we're just trying to get people who are working for a living to be able to do that, earn a living to survive. Not everybody will get rich. Not everybody will have the same, beautiful house or nice car. That's not the way America works. But basic housing, basic decent school system, basic health care, and a decent wage, I think that's achievable. So that's the question mark. But just raising taxes and feeding all those programs and raising spending in those programs without actually tying it back to the individual worker and giving the worker the opportunity and the independence financially from a better wage, and then reducing some of the other dependency on programs, that's got to be the next phase for the Democrats politically if they think they can hold on in 2022 when traditionally the party of the president loses seats. And the second thing traditionally up until 2018 was that suburban, well-off, better educated voters vote in midterm elections. Lower income voters don't vote necessarily in midterm elections. And we know the Democrats did really well with a whole mix of voters in 2020. To keep that base, they've got to get this messaging right.
President Biden has said, at least previously, that he expects to be a one-term president. How does that change the dynamic of those members of his cabinet and the certainly the way that Congress presents itself as an antagonist or a supporter.
I'm not persuaded that Biden keeps that commitment. He's a very robust 78-year-old. We'll, of course, wish all our presidents good health. And he may decide, why should I bow out? Maybe I stay, maybe I go. I'm not sure. He should certainly revisit that because, as you know, if he's determined not to run again, then I think the second 2 years of his administration become highly unproductive. So I think he's got to hold out. He's got a long time before he has to decide, probably as late as September, October of 2023, before he really has to decide yes or no. Yeah. So if I were Biden, I would say, I like this job. It's going well. I might want to keep it. And it certainly would help Vice President Kamala Harris if she chooses to run for president. If Biden stays in it longer, that would deter a lot of other people from getting out to Iowa and other places, New Hampshire, in 2023. So we'll see how everything goes, but I'm not persuaded now that he promises not to run. His press secretary was asked that question last Friday. Will the president file re-election papers to form a re-election committee as Donald Trump did?
On day one, right?
On day one. And Laurie, she said, he hasn't done it yet, but he hasn't discussed that with me. So I think we'll see, because the people who might want to challenge him might also be in their 70s. Who knows where we go on this, but it's not a good idea to absolutely decide you're not going to run and tell the whole world that. He can do that in 2023, late 23, and that would give him enough time to get the bulk of his agenda passed.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the president's spokeswoman, Jensaki, and I, for one, think she's doing an amazing job. So I want to give her a shout out. Watched her 3 or 4 days in a row now, and she has brought, a certain demeanor that's very welcome to the podium. What do you think?
I thought I only watched the full press conference on her first day, and I thought it was a pretty good day in terms of press conferences. And this is something that I think is important, again, for women. We've seen for a long time, right? We've seen, going back to Clinton, when Dee Dee Myers was the first sort of press secretary spokesperson, and she was very quickly sort of shuffled away in place of men. And under Obama, we had men. Under George W. Bush, I believe we had men. Now we had women in other departments like State Department and other places like that. But it's important. And under Trump has had a fair number of women as press spokespeople. And they run into different kinds of problems in terms of constantly spending lots of time explaining what the president tweeted. And in this case, the press secretary won't have that responsibility because Biden is likely not to be tweeting himself. His staff will tweet, and there'll be a communications team that will decide what goes out and how it goes out. So I think that's going to be a much more coordinated effort, and that will relieve the pressure on Psaki to spend time in these briefings, explaining the tweets, and she can spend more time answering questions about the substantive policy moves of the Biden administration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. That's very interesting. I saw some stuff over the weekend, people suggesting to President Biden that the first thing he might do is delete his Twitter account.
I don't think that's a good idea. He doesn't have as many followers as former President Trump, but Twitter is still useful. It's agenda setting in some ways. It's a communication mechanism. It's not exactly FDR's fireside chats, but it has that potential. And Trump, whether you like Trump or you didn't like Trump, Trump was brilliant at figuring out how to connect with the ordinary person who felt like they were hearing it from him when they read his tweets. And of course, that was for good for President Trump politically, and then bad for the country on January 6th, when many of the rioters were interviewed, said, my president told me to come here and do this, not only at the speech itself, but certainly in his tweets. So that's the downside of it. But if you think about it, it's this incredibly efficient way of establishing a one-to-one relationship between the president of the United States, just as when the radio addresses would come into people's living rooms, and you can tweet back, right? You can comment. And I would not recommend that he get rid of that. I think that's still an opportunity also to get feedback, even if it's, bad feedback or the comments are difficult. I think getting feedback directly from people who are engaged on Twitter is a form of polling. And you want to collect as much information about how people are viewing your policies as you possibly can if you're president of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of Twitter, I want to point out that we are live on Twitter, we are live on Facebook, and we are live on YouTube for this episode of Chamber TV, episode number 106, with Dr. Wendy Schiller, professor of political science at Brown University, and most notably, and I want to give you a hearty shout out for this, the Royce family professor of teaching excellence in political science at Brown University. So we know you're a very passionate and well-educated individual, and you bring a lot of perspective to this role. And congratulations for being such a role model for your students.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, so let's just keep going on this issue of what's happening at our nation's capital, and then we'll switch over to Governor McKee and what we can expect from him. But just sticking with this whole notion of the Biden-Raimondo administration, a lot of interest is now being paid to Vice President Kamala Harris and her groundbreaking role as the first woman vice president and also the first woman of color. A lot of people really are fascinated by her story. Lots of coverage in the media about her background and her life and her future plans potentially. What do you make of Vice President Kamala Harris, and how did she present herself to the nation in your view last Wednesday?
Well, I mean, I think Kamala Harris this is a fascinating time for America to have a female vice president, and certainly a woman of color, African American, and of South Asian descent. It's path breaking, so the question is, does she become a path breaker and engage in a style that is different from prior vice presidents, sort of just because of who she is and being a woman? Or does she just be the vice president that she's going to be and make being a woman just part of the, not even part of the conversation? That's going to be a choice she'll have to make. I think she's going to want to emphasize, her skills. She's got a tremendous background in justice enforcement, law enforcement as a prosecutor. She's got policy experience in the Senate. She's certainly interested in things like mass incarceration, reforming the judicial system, and of course, immigration reform, which it seems as though at the moment, President Biden is sort of giving to Kamala Harris as somebody who can lead that effort, not only in the administration to form the policy, but also in dealing with Congress on it. So I think for her, that's going to be the question. Does she do more events, for example, or more virtual events at the moment with women's groups? Does she find a way to have more women and more people of color in her vice presidential sphere, on her staff, for example? Certainly the Biden administration itself is the most diverse in the history of the country in terms of gender, in terms of racial, ethnic background, and also sexual orientation. So when you think about that, that's the question mark. And remember, Kamala Harris may very well want to run for president. I think she does. She already did once. And that every step she takes as vice president is also laying the groundwork to run for president. So that there's a lot of competing forces on Kamala Harris. In some ways, more competing forces than on President Biden.
Mm-hmm. So her husband, the interesting role that he is now going to play as the first gentleman.
Yeah, he's apparently, my understanding, he's an entertainment lawyer based in Los Angeles. I imagine he's going to have to recuse himself from a lot of things. I'm not sure how he continues. We know that Dr. Jill Biden will try to continue being a teacher. She teaches at a local community college in Virginia right now. I'm not sure what she'll continue to do, but he may be able to continue to do some advisory work in his law practice, but it's unclear whether there'll be any conflicts of interest. So we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Yeah, I think he may be in a position where he is planning to depart the law firm DLA Piper and be in a fully supportive role to the vice president. So Wendy, let's transition over to what's happening in Rhode Island as Governor Raimondo turns the reins of power over to Lieutenant Governor Dan McKee. So what are your observations on this?
I think Dan McKee has, he's been in Rhode Island a long time. It was mayor and then lieutenant governor. He's run for statewide office. I think that the issue will be getting up to speed with how the administration, the Raimondo administration runs, who he feels he can work with in that administration for the next year and a half till 2022, who he feels shares his concern for the economy in particular. I think there'll be a shift. It's an interesting, for the first time, maybe the legislature, the Democratic Party in the legislature may be more liberal than the governor, or the Democratic governor. A Republican governor, that's sort of a given, although when we have Republican governors, the legislature was pretty conservative. But now you've got Shekarchi, you've got Blazewicz, you've got, a pretty loud progressive voice in the chamber. And McKee is known to be very concerned with small business development and very concerned with education, certainly with charter schools. But it's unclear just how liberal he is, how progressive he is. And if he's going to win the nomination, if he runs for governor in the primary, we can see at least a three-way contest for the governorship coming down the pike. Probably, between Seth Magaziner, another slip, I'm showing my age, Seth Magaziner, Nellie Gorbea potentially, possibly Jorge Orza, that's three already, and Dan McKee. You're going to split the party up. So you have to figure out who your core base will be if you want to run for re-election. And he's going to play to his strengths, which is small business, the economy, and education, but not necessarily public teachers union education. So I think that's what I'm waiting to see. What I hope for the McKee transition is that the COVID-19 vaccinations, which we hope will ramp up, certainly the ways in which the state has really tried to contain the epidemic, sometimes the pandemic, sometimes very successfully, sometimes not quite as successfully, that there's no big shift in messaging because that will confuse people. And I don't think that will be conducive to success in the end. So in that, say, steady as she goes, probably. But then in the other realms of emphasizing the things to get the economy back, McKee has a natural advantage there, I think. The question is, does he surround himself by the people he's always known, which is natural. He's announced a lot of the people that he's going to consult. And does he also outreach to people that are currently doing things that he may not know personally? That's the big question mark. And then how does he develop a relationship with Shekarchi, certainly and Ruggiero in the Senate? And those are really, I think, important things to think about.
So much there to dig into, Wendy. So the notion of the appointment of the lieutenant governor and whether that's going to stay as codified in Rhode Island law, or do you think the General Assembly takes that issue up and puts forth a different path for the future?
I don't know how that's going to go. I think it's probably normally it would be a pretty important thing. I think changing the way we elect a lieutenant governor, it should come along with changing the responsibilities of lieutenant governor. Right? I mean, if you're going to go to the trouble to have the General Assembly choose the lieutenant governor, then give the lieutenant governor more statutory things to do. Give the lieutenant governor more power, because otherwise I'm not sure what the fuss is about. So that's my point on this whole sort of who should choose lieutenant governor. If we're going to draw attention to the office, maybe we require the governor and lieutenant governor to share more power, or require more consultation, or we give the lieutenant governor a particular portfolio, possibly small business, for example, something like that. But otherwise, I'm not sure why Rhode Islanders should be that concerned about this decision at this point in time.
Yeah. So should the office be bracketed?
Yeah. I mean, I or elect them as a team. I think that you elect them separately, but maybe just elect them as a team, like we do the president of the United States and the vice president, and maybe that would be conducive to power sharing. And I think it would give Rhode Islanders a chance to think about, maximizing leadership at the top rather than just having this sort of governor and then a lieutenant governor that has a fairly undefined role.
Mm-hmm. How likely do you think it is that Governor McKee would choose either Secretary of State Nellie Gorbea or Treasurer Seth Magaziner, and as a follow-on, the degree to which either one of them would be interested in taking that nomination or appointment?
I cannot speak for either one of those people, but I think Nellie Gorbea has established herself as a very forceful and active Secretary of State and has a record that she is proud of, and she's won re-election. Seth Magaziner, same thing, a record he's quite proud of. He's been very active in that job. I'm not sure why you want to leave both of those jobs, which are independent podiums, where you have an independent communications team and you have specific accomplishments you can point to if you're running for governor, to become lieutenant governor in a circumstance where the responsibilities of lieutenant governor are not well defined.
Interesting. So his portfolio and his interest in supporting small business, what does that mean, and where do you expect he's likely to go in his first 100 days in office? What would you recommend to him if you were advising him?
I think the governor is very well aware that, in fact, you have to get a handle on COVID before anything in the economy has come back, particularly for summertime for Rhode Island, particularly for tourism. People have to feel safe. The dining industry, restaurant taxes, you got to get restaurants back in their game. And I think that's a big selling point for Providence, Rhode Island. We have a lot of people who come in the summer. You got to make people believe that we are a safe state and that we are going to continue to be a safe state. That is crucial. You can't get the economy back in any other way. After that, I would expect McKee to look at the tax structure for business here, to look at minimum wages, to see how you can get those things together. I think in the Democratic primary, if he's not active on the minimum wage, that's going to be a liability for him. But I think his sweet spot in the Democratic primary running for governor is, of course, the small business community and their support. So those are the things I would deal with for him later. Keeping on message that Rhode Island is conscientious and smart about COVID safety, and that we will continue to be. We'll try to bring business back up, but we don't want to have another surge. That's going to have to be the messaging, I think, for the first 100 days of his administration, which overlaps with the Biden administration at the national level.
Yeah, there is no question that getting the vaccine into the arms of people is job one, both here in Rhode Island and on the national stage as well. Nothing is going to happen until we have herd immunity and the degree to which the vaccine is widely available, and whether or not it's the one or the Moderna, the Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson coming up with an additional entree into the market. How do you see, what do you think where do you think we'll be in the next 100 days relative to vaccine rollout?
I unfortunately am not overly confident. I think the messaging from Washington has been coming out is pretty bad, which is that it just isn't the dosage, right? We thought there were all these dosages. We thought that, President Trump had said, I'm just checking my battery life on my computer. I might have to run and get my charger. That there's all these doses. Well, we've got them all in reserve. We're going to send them out, staggered. It's not true. So now we got a problem that Pfizer and Moderna are real companies. They're international companies. They've committed to other countries. They're going to give us as much as they promised, but they're not going to give us some at the expense of other commitments they've made legally. So we have a vaccine problem. We don't have enough. And that's not Rhode Island's fault, but that's the concern. And that's a concern at the national level and a concern at the Rhode Island level. The good news is it seems like a lot of people want to get vaccinated, which is great. I think we were really concerned that people would be scared of it and not want to do it. We are hearing some things about some workers not wanting to take it in nursing homes and other facilities. I have no knowledge of that, but I hope that if they feel comfortable and they don't have conditions that would make them nervous, that they do take it. But I think more people want it than not, and that is key. It's almost as if the shortage is making people want it more. And whatever that psychology is, that's okay, because that's the most important thing. But I'm not optimistic. I think that we will probably be longer in the coming for the vaccine for most of us in Rhode Island than we would wish. Probably April, May, June. But I think if we can get enough of us vaccinated, then I think the summer season in Rhode Island hopefully can be salvaged. And we know economically that's just crucially important for our state.
I was reading some comments that former Brown University professor Darrell West was saying over the weekend, and he said he received the vaccine yesterday or last week, and he's 66, and he said in DC the protocol is anyone over 65. So there's that tension there between how do you define the next round of eligibility? Is it choosing certain sectors and industries, or the notion of, let's just focus on age. Thoughts on how that plays out from both a communications perspective and as a political perspective, because we know that those are elements that are being considered.
Well, I think that I think two things. One is, I know people in DC, I hear that they're getting vaccinated. DC is a very different entity than a normal state. So I think that's one of the big things. And I also don't know the disparity racially in DC. DC has a large African-American population and Latino population that tends to be less well off than white population in DC. So there could be differences of literally connections to get the vaccine and outreach. I don't see that in Rhode Island, which I'm happy about. I'm grateful for that. They're trying really hard not to create those kinds of economic and racial and ethnic disparities in who gets the vaccine. So that's really important. And I think depending on your population, we have an older population. We're tied, about 14 states have the percentage of people over the age of 65 that we do. So we have an older population. We have people in nursing homes, and we've got to prioritize them. You've got to think that way. And so I think that's the big thing. We've got healthcare workers, and you've got nursing home people, and you've got older people in the nursing homes. So that's the priority for our state based on who we are and what our composition is. And every state will be different in this regard. Some people will just do flat age. Some people will do sectors. And I think the governor has made a pretty good decision in terms of where we've seen the most deaths from COVID and the most immediate spread in congregate settings. And DC doesn't have that same kind of population distribution. And, we don't know what the vaccination rates in DC are, as I said, among large communities of color and in less well-off areas. So that's where we have to just look inward and say, what's Rhode Island doing with the vaccine that we have? And do we think that the people who are most vulnerable to dying of COVID and who are working in those settings are getting protected first? And then we will just have to wait our turn and be as careful as we can.
Well, I don't want you to run out of battery life, Wendy. So I'll let you go in a couple of minutes, but I did want to just touch on one last subject, and that is, we've gone through the changing dynamics of leadership at the national level and at in the governor's office as well. Let's just spend a couple of minutes on the General Assembly and the changing nature and complexion of that body.
The General Assembly. I think that right now it looks like Ruggiero and Cicarci, it seems to me, are communicating. It looks like there's some changes in the leadership structure of the General Assembly that are reflective of the changes in the electorate and the changes in the Democratic Party in terms of city councils, of mayors. The state's changing. In terms of the role of women of color, the role of people who are beyond sort of the traditional Portuguese, Italian, Irish kind of set that has run the state for a long time. And that changed a while ago in terms of the the mayorship, for example, of Central Falls and of Providence. But now it's gone beyond. And I think that is the smart move. You want to be ahead of where people want you to be. You don't want to be behind playing catch up. And it seems that Cicarci knows that. And I think that he seems to have set the tone for the General Assembly in terms of harassment, racial discrimination. He wants a functioning body that is 21st century and attuned to all the needs of Rhode Islanders, all of us as a community, rather than, quote unquote, the old guard. So that seems to be the messaging that's being sent out. And I'm hopeful for the state that it will be.
Mm-hmm. And the Senate, President Ruggiero, has a Senate chamber that is probably more liberal than what we've seen before.
Yes, and he's shown adaptation too. He's very adaptive, Ruggiero, and I think that they'll have to make some tough financial decisions. We'll see what happens with the car tax and how it gets phased in from now on. But I think he's got his finger on the pulse as well, and I think they both want to be successful.
Professor Wendy Schiller from Brown University, and most importantly, the Royce Family Professor of Teaching Excellence in Political Science. Always want to reinforce that. Thank you so much for being with us today. As always, you've been very insightful and enjoyable to chat with, and you've been with us multiple times, and we really appreciate your insights. And I know your battery is draining fast.
I know, it's pathetic. I should be at the point after 9 months of virtual that everything's all charged up and everything's great for tech, but I'm never organized enough. So, but thank you so much for the opportunity. I love these conversations. So hopefully you'll invite me back.
Thank you, Wendy. Take care.
Take care.